Hi there, Mary here. I just recorded an entire Facebook Live completely blank. So I'm starting over, um, wanting to talk with you today about what is a conscious business? What does that mean? Because we're not talking about businesses within a certain industry that relate to consciousness, like this isn't about yoga or retreat centers. Um, we're really talking about something very specific, a niche within the business organizational world that you may not know about, you may be interested in delving into. So, three key elements of a conscious business, and the first is that conscious businesses have self-management systems. So perhaps you've heard of holacracy, a very formal one that you can get trained in, but there's many other structures that different conscious businesses have employed. And essentially, we're looking for alternatives to the traditional hierarchy, the sort of like sense of like there's not this central command and control that makes decisions. This is self-management has different decision-making processes that allow people to have much more say over the types of things that impact their day-to-day. So for example, there's an advice process, different versions of it that essentially mean that like you have the power to make decisions as long as you check in with the other people that would be impacted by the types of things that you're considering, whether it's a budgetary thing or whether it's a systems thing that you're considering employing or bringing in for either your own self or for your whole department. This is it's an innovation and saves a lot of time, actually makes things much more efficient, is what these businesses have discovered. And already kind of alluding to this, there's a certain kind of co-holding of resource allocation, such as the budget. So, like everybody has a certain say in aspects that impact them and a certain responsibility for upholding the organizational goals, and how to support the big picture, right? So self-management. The second is wholeness. And this is something that I think maybe more of you may experience even in traditional business models, is this welcoming, this sort of enabling of employees to kind of present their full personas at work. Even businesses that allow you to bring your kids and have childcare on site, or have meals, or there's different ways that we invite wholeness, rather than just show up at work compartmentalized. This is a place for your work identity. You need to leave the rest of you elsewhere. Wholeness is welcomed with this recognition that the more whole people are, the happier they'll be, and the more they'll be able to actually bring the fullness of their skills into their role. Evolutionary purpose is the third attribute. And this really talks about like what is the deeper reason that an organization exists? Is it like how is it wanting to make a difference in the communities that it serves or operates in, and not just at a philosophical level, not just like at the really like do you have a mission statement, but also like what do your day-to-day practices look like, and do they line up? How do your customers see the alignment between your evolutionary purpose and their experience of your product? All of these things are really held in a very certain way. This is a priority in a conscious business. And specifically within a very particular model, these three attributes have another name that you might have guessed already. These can be called Teal businesses. And Teal businesses, this is, there's a whole like other system that I want to just briefly mention that overlays. There's this model of adult development that when they talk about different levels, organizationally, we see that organizations also fit into some of these different levels. So a Teal business, represents all of these attributes and others as well. And really like it's about like an organization sort of like seeing where all the parts work synergistically, in support of the whole versus needing, one power center that makes everything run and kind of powers over what any of the parts may be interested in. So I want to talk briefly about this. And by the way, if you're interested at all, there's a book that talks a lot about Teal organizations. It's called Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. Came out a couple of years ago, made a real big splash. And in it, part of what made the book so impactful is the author really looked at case studies of specific businesses and how they employed these, how they dealt with the skepticism people had about like, was this really going to work? Is this really going to be more efficient? He looks at all kinds of different companies, food processing and HR. And there's one of my favorites is this in-home nursing care organization in the Netherlands. And he documents like how some of these shift from these sort of more traditional models. In this case, it's like, well, how do the nurses self-organize their schedule? And how does that work with the budget for everybody and the distribution of patients? And, how is this solvent? So this is a place where you can kind of get a sense of like what it really looks like in a very practical way. But, Teal organizations, like just to kind of give you a frame of reference, most of the organizations in our culture we would think of as orange. So orange organizations, this particular level, it's like these are your multinational companies, they're your investment banks and charter schools, right? Innovation, accountability, meritocracy, like the idea is like competition and profit and growth, right? Like this is sort of like the sort of core organizing principles, right? And businesses that want to like take it a step beyond that are called green businesses in this model. And this model is called spiral dynamics. I didn't mention spiral dynamics are some integral. It's developed, like I said, outside of the context of work. Initially, it's more about personal development for adults, but green businesses really do come into this space of like looking at empowerment and motivation and egalitarian, like how to have a stakeholder model where everybody's invested. So business is known for being a little bit more idealistic, like Ben and Jerry's or Starbucks or Southwest Airlines, right? Might be considered green businesses. So and then Teal, we've already sort of talked about, the self-management, wholeness, evolutionary purpose, and really stepping out of the traditional hierarchy. So what does any of this have to do with NVC? This is the last thing I really want to work with, at least briefly. Why do these businesses often want their employees to have NVC skills? So the first is because these businesses are so much about self-leadership, and NVC, when applied and mastered, NVC really facilitates bridging power differentials and setting up power with structures. That doesn't mean that everybody's the same because different people have different sets of expertise, but like how do we still collaborate in ways that still have flow, right? Secondly, can imagine that this would be an issue perhaps to avoid the consensus trap. So Mickey Cashton talks about this. She calls it the tyranny of consensus. And a lot of baby giraffes, sort of people who are new at NVC are get stuck in this space of like, well, my needs matter and I care about their needs and I care about organizational needs, and get into this place where decisions take a very long time and are really exhausting and use up a lot of the group's resources. So NVC really, when you start to apply some of the deeper skills in terms of running meetings more effectively, in terms of having the capacity to be more productive in collaborations. Well, these things really do support or provide alternatives, both to like a top-down decision-making process and to a consensus. It's like there are other options, and that's part of what gets developed when you integrate NVC. Last, because self-management, frankly, requires you to be able to speak up, to make requests, to have skill, you know, rather than avoid all those situations that are a little bit awkward, or, you know, that kind of like that dilemma of being the bulldozer or the doormat, you know, or, you know, like sort of this awkward way of dealing with blunt opinions, you know. So NVC really supports folks in having a sense of how to show up in this way that's mindful and direct. Again, this is all about efficiency and productivity and compassion, you know, all at the same time. So so I hope this gave you some interesting food for thought. If you want to make sure that you don't miss future broadcasts, please, you know, set yourself up so that you you turn on the notifications and or like the page. Certainly can share this with anybody who's like-minded at work. This has sparked any ideas for you in terms of a particular team dynamic, or like maybe even wanting to bring in somebody to start to talk about some of these concepts, or make an NVC intro training for your team, or do some facilitation work. Just want to get some wheels turning, and we'll be back next week with another video. So thanks so much.